Hey everyone, welcome to the start of week 4. We had a busy week last week. Hopefully, it sounds like most of us have our ebooks now, or maybe one or two are still trying to figure that out. So if you're having any issues, please again, just reach out to me. And then I'll probably just put you in contact with the bookstore. So yeah, I hope you're having a great start to your week. So this past week we talked about ritual, we talked about Native American dances, and we started to really dive into this idea of cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation and how much they can intersect with one another. So we also watched the Zuni Rainbow Dance, and as well as the Smoke-Eye Tribe's interpretation of the Dance of the Snakes. Yeah, and then we watched the Les Twins, and then we also read an article from Lynette Russell about the Smoke-Eye Tribe. So I just wanted to just give a couple of key takeaways that I want you to be aware of, and most of you wrote about these in your written reflections this week, and to some degree, but just wanted to point some of the things out that I was noticing, and just make sure that you're noticing those as well. So if we go to our ebook and that chapter 1, part 1, I guess the most important thing for this is just it breaks down those three sort of categories that again are, to me, always are intersecting all the time of what choreography and dance can be or is, which is imitation, form, and expression. And so imitation, again, is you're imitating something that's happening that you see another person. Dance could be, if we're going back to the Native American dances, it could be a lot of animal dances. So they would see different animals and imitate those and create dances like the snake dance. You've got the second one, which is form, which the way that this author explains it is that it's an aesthetic. So it's just the visual, that it doesn't have meaning. But to me, I think dance always has some sort of meaning depending on the person who's dancing it or the people who are watching it. But typically it's the form, so it's the way that the aesthetic. So think of it as like what you're watching, what you're looking at more than anything. And then the expression, which is the human side of it. So the feelings and emotions that you are expressing while you are moving, while you're dancing. And so she picks out a couple different videos, not videos, but people or groups to look at. But the Les Twins is the video that I sent you, because they were, as you saw, fantastic. And the author says that they do all three of those. And again, I think you can argue that most dance is going to at least connect 2 or 3 of those all the time. But many of you really wrote about how dynamic they were. Thought it was really interesting how they were imitating, movements like Michael Jackson's movements, but then creating them into their own way of doing that, which again, we see later if we go back into some of our reading historically with the Smoke-Eye Tribe and the Native American culture that they borrowed from, or however we want to explain that also is happening all the time. But what I guess the questions are really the moral questions, and I don't know that we ever will have an exact answer for those. But yeah, Les Twins were really great. And then that same chapter of the ebook she talks about this idea of rituals. And so she explains it as a tradition or a repeated activity. And every single culture has some sort of a traditional dance that they do. And again, we were tying into the Native American culture this week. She talks about myth, which is basically, she says, a way of explaining things that are happening in the world, and then magic, which is a form of prayer, and how all of these things can be interrelated into how we create our rituals. She spends a lot of time talking about the daily rituals and the monthly rituals and the yearly rituals we do. And then I think that's interesting to see how dance plays a part in that as well, especially Native American dance, since that's what we're focusing on. Then she goes into these 2 ideas of ritual. So there's ritual preservation and then ritual evolution. So ritual preservation is really keeping things the same way, repeating them pretty much exactly the same way with very little change. So it's very the traditional view, which we saw in that Zuni Rainbow Dance, even though that was a contemporary video, obviously, of that that Native American tribe performing that dance, it seemed to me that from my research on it, that is a dance that is repeated and passed down over and over again. So they're preserving that ritual so that it stays the same through the generations. And then the second way is our ritual evolution, which we see in our reading as well as in that video of the Smoke-Eye tribe, which was a white tribe that lived in Arizona, in Prescott, Arizona, that was very heavily influenced by the Native American culture, the Hopi tribes and some other tribes in that area. And they took and manipulated and changed those dances and created them into their own, which you could argue is ritual evolution. Now, ritual evolution also happens within cultures, not just within people who are appropriating or borrowing from cultures. So it's changing. It's the evolution of the dances and the rituals are changing as the people's beliefs change and shift. So those are the two there. And then I really want to spend a little bit more time here talking about this this article, this printout article that we had, the Dancing Identity, the annual Smoke-Eye Ceremonial Dances of Prescott, Arizona by Lynette Russell. See, I have all my highlights and notes there. Because that really does get, it scratches the surface of it, because this idea of cultural appropriation and appreciation is very dynamic. We're grappling with these ideas all the time, even in our what's happening in our world today, always, especially because, in American culture, we have so many different cultures that have come to create this American culture, and it's always changing, it's always evolving, and all these questions of who does it belong to and what right do we have to take or continue and change up these traditions are conversations that are constantly going on in the dance world, as well as in other art forms, like music and theater and all those other art forms, visual art. So so this dancing identity. So I found this really interesting. So if you watch the video, I mean, it's an original video from I think it's from the 20s or 30s, probably the 20s. There's no sound, but right away you can tell that, like even just the way that they're putting on a different like makeup on. So they're definitely trying to step into that role in the costuming of creating this dance, this snake dance. And the whole purpose behind this. So this started originally it said the late 1880s, there was this rodeo kind of thing that was happening in Prescott, and they were looking for ways to boost boost attendance. So looking for ways to make money to get people to come to the rodeo. And so there was a group of Indians that were native to, indigenous to that area, which were called the Yavapai. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Yavapai Indians. And that made up, at that time, only less than 1% of the population in Prescott was of that tribe, even though that they were indigenous to that area. And the rest were mostly white. And so even though it sounds like from the reading, you probably saw this too, and this happens still to this day, the white Americans that lived in this area, even though they were not indigenous, they still felt very connected to the material goods that were present there. So, some of the rugs and the pottery and the handcrafts and the baskets and the things the physical things, the decorations and accoutrement that the Native Americans were producing, they felt very like they were a part of their own history. And in some ways they were, but they weren't the ones creating them, but just because they had lived there for so long. And so, so in about the 20s, I think 30s, in the 20s, they created this show, right? So, which was a part of the rodeo. And, at first, it was very much, it sounds like exaggerated and comedic and kind of a caricature of the dances. So it was very much like imitative, that they were just kind of like, oh, this is fun, this'll work, it'll entertain people. But then it sounds like it sounds like a little bit later after that, there was a shift that happened. And so this shift sort of was, okay, what can we do they wanted to start researching more. So they started studying, they started researching, a couple of the women who were in the tribe. So they started out with only Smoke Eye white men were allowed. And then a little bit later, some of the women were involved. What can we do to really make this not just us taking something, but how can we really be knowing what that culture's values are, and how can we try to do that in the performances that we have? So 2 women really did that. They went and they lived with the Hopi reservation and people, and so they really got to understand and know the culture, and they brought that back. But of course, you can still argue that at the end, they were still, the purpose of them including this, I mean, at least part of it was monetary, right? So they wanted to create entertainment for people to come to the rodeo. But it got so ingrained in the Smoke Eye tribe's culture that it began to feel like that was a part of their own culture, because they were adapting it and they were shifting it, and they were creating their own types of hierarchy, just similar to what the Native Americans would do with the men in this tribe and the women in this tribe, and what their roles were and their dances were, even though they had not actually grown up and been in those societies. So I guess I have a few questions. So when you don't have a culture of we all have cultures, of course, and we all belong to cultures, whether we consider ourselves that way or not. But eventually the Smoke Eye tribe ended in the 90s. And there's a couple different reasons. The Smoke Eye tribe will say that it just started phasing out, that it was too time and cost effective to continue these big performances, and that just societal shifts were changing. So people wanted to go watch TV and they didn't want to go to live shows, which is still happening now. But really, in the majority of this, why it ended is that there was just a lot of protests from Native Americans that just finally were like, they were really making sure that their rights were heard. And they didn't have a lot of rights back in the 20s and 30s and around that time and later. So in the 80s and 90s, they really started protesting and saying, this group is taking our cultural, rites of passage and dances, and they're making money off of it. And no one asked us, we didn't give permission, and all these things. So eventually it was, the shows got canceled. But I just think it's interesting why a group of people like the Smoke Eye tribe would adopt, what would be some of the reasons why they might adopt another culture's dances and create them and make them their own. Why would you borrow from another culture? So somehow you're trying to, you see that there's these dances are maybe creating joy and celebration and sorrow and mourning, and there are these rituals that they've created. And so if you're not finding that your culture has those things, or you're bored by those things, maybe you reach out and try to find other cultures to do that. And again, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but I'm saying maybe that could be one reason why they created these, or kind of took and borrowed and changed these traditions that they saw. Another thing is that, so if we find that this is more on the line of appropriation as opposed to appreciation, which I think the research is pretty clear that it is, should they have asked permission? How would they ask permission? Who would they ask permission from? If they do ask permission, how are they profiting from this? Who gets part of that profit? So is it a monetary profit? Is it just an emotional, social profit? So this is more like general for anyone who's looking to borrow from culture. What is the process that one goes through, the moral process of, I really love what's happening here, and I want to try to do this myself and make it my own. So is that right or wrong? Or how do I ask permission for it? And so these are really, really hard, difficult questions. But one of the ways that they did start to do that is, like I said, a couple of these women. So let's see if I can find their names in this article. The white women from the Smoke Eye tribe, Kate T. Corey and Marie Tumber, they began to research and rehearse and study Native dances, and they lived in the culture. So that might be one way, but did they still get permission? I don't know. That is unclear. And to me, that's important, or at least acknowledging where these dances came from, which they did, but to what degree, I'm not sure. Yeah. let's see. And then this is a quote from the article that this was not even a quote. It's just the idea of that this has been going on for forever. This idea of there's a history in our world and specifically in our country of appropriation, hobbyism, and reenactments. You have World War II enactments. You have all these things where we see something that's happening. We're attracted to it in some way. We make it our own and we change it. And so that has been going on and on and on and on and on. And I think now that we're in 2023, we all know that there's a many of us know that there's a responsibility, especially for us artists, to acknowledge the history of where these dances came from, and or at least go and dig and research and find out where they came from, and give those people the contribution that they deserve, or that acknowledgement that they deserve, that this came from here, that these are my influences. And at the very least, stating that and putting that in your program notes, or putting that in your lectures, or putting that in your presentations of the art that you're creating. So this is one of the things about dance appreciation, is being aware of all those things. And it's not just with dance, right? It's with any type of tradition or cultural ritual. So then I found this other article that was written by the same author, Lynette Russell, and she really breaks down these 3 ideas of appropriation and authenticity. And it comes from scholar Richard A. Rogers that she's citing. And it talks about how that we categorize various types of cultural appropriation, which he broadly defines as the use of cultures, symbols, artifacts, genres, rituals, or technologies by members of another culture. There are, according to his schema, 4 types. So we have cultural exchange, and that's a reciprocity that exists between an exchange of art or dances or symbols, objects, stories, narratives, and that's between, and it says it takes place between roughly equal cultures. And then the next form of appropriation, he argues, is called cultural dominance. And this is where aspects of a dominant, often colonial culture, are used by members of a disposed or disempowered culture. So that would probably be in the instance of the Smoke-Eyed Tribe and the people of the Native Americans indigenous to Prescott. And then he talks about the third one, which is cultural exploitation, which involves the appropriation of cultural aspects of subordinated people by a more powerful, usually colonial, again, dominant culture without permission, compensation, or acknowledgement. And then he observes transculturation, which is a type of appropriation where concepts, ideas, and narratives from multiple cultures are reconfigured into a globalized or hybridized form. So all of these different kind of categorizations of appropriation are documented, and it also talks about how not all acts of appropriation are equal, especially in this case. The Hopi were powerless at that time because they didn't have any rights, especially in the 20s and 30s and 40s and those early, before the 80s and 90s. They didn't have many rights to speak out and protest what was being taken. But when they did have that power, they made sure that they were able to voice their opinions, and it took a long time, but that it was eventually stopped, that performance. And then the tribe itself just completely collapsed. And so many people were quoted saying that they felt like they weren't dancers anymore in the Smoke-Eyed Tribe because they didn't have a place to practice their dancing. And so it's just interesting how that space created the culture for that tribe, even though it was a culture that was taken from another culture. So again, very complex. And then in this article, she also talks about this other article that you guys didn't read, but identities and belonging. And it says that identities can be based, as we know, on age, sexual preference, ethnicity, racial, regional, philosophical, and political divides. But even though we each have these labels and we're sort of individuals within these communities, identities and categories, or identity categories are they're always intersecting. You can be more than one thing at one time. We all know there's more than one of these. You can live in more than one of these categories at one time. And so she says, according to this article, the native born requires some means to express how he or she belongs. It might be similar to an indigenous belonging, yet native-born belonging is built on dispossession. So the very nature of settler society is that the dispossessed, the original on their original inhabitants, and the native born, the settler, is unsettled because of it. The Smoke-Eye too are unsettled. As they dance their borrowed dances, they reveal their anxiety about how they might belong. So people know when they're doing the things that are not theirs. And so even though they might kind of just create all these rules and structures and boundaries and things for people to be in their tribe, they know that they're not actually theirs, right? So the settlers are unsettled because they went and are living and taking off of the land that was of the indigenous people. And so they said that there's like this underlying anxiety that's happening in some of in this tribe, or at least that's the argument that the author's making. Yeah, so there's always this hybridity that's happening though. So they also said that the Smoke-Eye tribe felt connected to that past because they were physically digging up. So there were archaeologists at the time and still now digging up these artifacts. And so that they were living on this land and the artifacts felt like theirs because they were living there even though they weren't actually theirs. And so that also made them feel like that they could take other things like dance and create and make their own thing out of them. So it sounds pretty straightforward in some ways, but in many ways, again, we don't, the context of this all is that we were not living there at this time. And so we, just like now, people are going to look at us in 50, 60, 100 years and be like, wow, we weren't living at that time. And so how could you do this? How could you do that? And so we would have to really explain the history and, why we make choices that we do. And so living in a time isn't as cut and dry as we think it is. However, there's still some things that happen that should not happen, in my opinion. So that is some ideas of cultural appreciation and appropriation. We're going to continue talking about that, but within different cultures next week. So in week 4, I have a lot of videos I want you to watch, a little bit more than we've done in the past. So we're really going to start talking about and reading about and writing about and watching flamenco. We're going to talk about Bharatanatyam, and we're going to watch belly dance. So really awesome, meaty, amazingly deep and meaningful cultural dances that are happening here and how appropriation and appreciation has also affected them. Also, especially in terms of belly dancing, this idea of the sexualization of the female body and the male gaze. We're going to start to read about that. And I have a bunch of questions here that I want you to go ahead and take a look at as you're reading and watching. And you don't have to answer all of them, but choose the top 3 or 4 that really you connected with. And write about those things and see where it takes you. And it's like always, 300 words at least, but I feel like it's hard to get into some of these questions really deeply with only 300 words. So, if you go a little bit beyond that, don't let 300 be the stopping point, especially if you have a really strong train of thought and you want to keep going with it. Just go ahead and do that. Yeah, so I'll just break it down real quick. It's all on Blackboard, but you're going to read chapter 1, part 3 of the ebook, which is flamenco. It's ritual and then flamenco. And then you're going to read 2 articles that are links. So the links are in Blackboard. One is about belly dance, ancient ritual to cabaret performance. And then the other one is Bharatanatyam, which is also a really great read. And then you're going to watch a bunch of video links and that'll round out the reading. And then of course, like I was just saying, you can answer some of those questions, reflection questions based on that. All right, I hope that makes sense and that you're enjoying or even at the very least thinking a little bit differently about what dance is, like always, and learning about some new types of dance and cultures of dance. I think that's all I have. Like always, please email me if you have any questions, and I hope you have a great week. Thanks. Bye.